Dawn at Willow Creek Harbor often arrives in a gentle hush, like a whisper from nature across the still waters and towering pine trees. The first rays of sunlight peek over the horizon, painting the lake in golden hues, creating a picture so perfect that you just want to stand still and take a deep breath. Here, time seems to slow down, making way for familiar sounds. The gentle lapping of waves against the dock, the cheerful chirping of birds in the branches, and the footsteps of villagers preparing for a new day. For Sophie Miller, the daughter of a local fisherman, this is not just home. It is her entire world. Sophie, a 23-year-old girl with her brown hair tied up high and eyes bright as a morning lake, grew up on these docks. Since she was a little girl, she had followed her father, James Miller, on fishing trips. She knew how to tie knots as securely as a seasoned sailor, could read the wind's direction by the tiny ripples on the water surface, and could even identify each type of fish just by the sounds they made when they splashed their tails. For Sophie, Willow Creek Harbor was not just a workplace. It was a part of her very being, a place where she felt a sense of peace that nowhere else could provide. This morning was no different from any other day, at least not at first. Sophie stood at the end of the main dock, her hands skillfully coiling the rope into neat circles. Her breath formed thin white puffs in the chilly morning air, blending with the scent of damp wood and the faint aroma of the lake. Inside the port office, Mr. Tom Grayson, the longtime manager, was checking the schedule for the day's charter boats. His old radio played soft country tunes, echoing through the slightly open window. Everything felt peaceful and familiar, like a song that had been heard hundreds of times and never got old. "Sophie, have you finished checking the nets yet?" James's voice called out from the small fishing boat anchored nearby. He stepped out from the cabin, his sun-weathered hands, scarred and rough, gripping an old fishing rod. James Miller, tall and lean with a face etched by sun and wind, looked just like any ordinary fisherman in this area. His gentle smile always put people at ease, as if he carried the calmness of the lake in every word he spoke. "All done, Dad," Sophie replied, her warm smile shining through. "Today, we have a group of guests coming down from the city to go salmon fishing. I think they'll love the new nets." James nodded, his gaze sweeping over the surface of the water. "Good. As long as they don't drop the fishing rod into the lake, like last week, we're fine." He chuckled softly, a warm sound blending into the morning air. Sophie laughed along, feeling as if everything in the world was perfectly in sync, perfectly in place. But then, amidst the laughter of the father and son, another sound began to creep into the small space, just enough to make Sophie pause. It was a distant roar, like the sound of a motorcycle engine echoing from the dirt road leading to the harbor. At first, she thought it was just an early delivery truck, but the noise grew louder, more intense, carrying with it an unsettling feeling. Sophie lifted her head, squinting her eyes toward the trail cutting through the pine forest. James also stopped, his hand tightening around the fishing rod, though his face remained calm. "What is that?" Sophie whispered more to herself than to anyone else. The noise was now unmistakably not just one vehicle, but many, blending into a threatening chorus. Her heart began to race, even as she tried to maintain a calm exterior. In Willow Creek, motorcycles weren't uncommon, but the way this sound roared and growled made her feel uneasy. From a morning mist, 5 figures gradually emerged, riding on their shiny motorcycles, the tires crunching over the gravel with a sharp sound. Their pitch-black leather jackets glinted in the weak sunlight, patches on their jackets depicting venomous snakes and the words Iron Reapers, a name that even Sophie, who rarely left the village, had heard whispered about in the local diner. These weren't just ordinary bikers. This was the most notorious gang in the area, the kind of people said to be devoid of mercy. Leading the crowd was Ethan Crow, a tall man with long black hair tied back and eyes as cold as steel. He turned off the first engine, leaving a heavy silence in place of the earlier roar. Sophie felt her hands tighten around the coil of rope, her knuckles turning white. She glanced at James, but he just stood there, his eyes squinting at the strangers, not saying a word. Ethan stepped out of the car, his heavy boots thudding against the ground, each sound echoing like a drumbeat signaling something ominous. He tilted his head, eyeing Sophie from head to toe with a smirk full of disdain. Well, look what we have here, his voice low and slow, as if he were toying with his prey. A pretty little girl playing with some boats, huh? Sophie swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. This is a private dock, she said, each word clear even though her heart was pounding in her chest. If you don't have a boat rental reservation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Ethan's laughter echoed, sharp and hollow, cutting to the quiet of the harbor. The others joined in, their laughter sounding like wolves howling in the night. A boat rental schedule? Ethan repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Listen up, little lady. The Iron Reapers don't need an appointment. Wherever we go, whatever we want, we just take it. He stepped closer, his boots thudding against the wooden dock, each step a silent threat. Sophie took a small step back, even though she didn't want to show any weakness. Behind Ethan, another man, tall and muscular, with the name Rusty stitched on his shirt, moved forward, blocking her escape toward the port office. The rest of the guys spread out, forming a loose circle around Sophie, like wolves closing in on their prey. This is a great spot, Ethan said, looking around the harbor with a greedy gaze. Quiet, peaceful. A perfect place for us to turn into our new headquarters. What do you think, sis? Sophie's heart raced so hard that she felt like it might leap out of her chest. She glanced over at James, who stood still by the boat, his eyes now sharper, though his expression remained unchanged. This is private property, she replied, her voice trembling but trying to stay steady. You're trespassing. I'm calling the police. Ethan let out a louder laugh, leaning down close to Sophie so she could smell the leather and cigarette smoke on him. The police, huh? Sweetheart, we just passed the sheriff a few miles back. He's busy dealing with a wreck on the highway. It's going to be a few hours before he's done. So, he paused, his smile turning more sinister. We got all day to have some fun here. Sophie felt a cold sweat running down her spine. She looked toward the office, where Tom Grayson stood behind the window, his hands trembling as he held the phone. She knew he was calling James, but her dad was right here, and he remained silent, motionless. That made her feel both reassured and anxious. Why wasn't he doing anything? Why wasn't he saying anything? Ethan reached out and touched the coil of rope in Sophie's hand, his fingers gliding over it as if he were inspecting a new toy. It's really cute, he whispered, his voice low and chilling. Did your dad teach you how to tie knots? He must be so proud to see his daughter taking over this little dock. Sophie pulled her hand back, her eyes flashing with anger. Leave, she said, this time unable to hide the tremor in her voice. Right now? Ethan smirked, taking another step closer, so close that Sophie could feel his breath on her face. What's it gonna be, sis? He tilted his head, his eyes glinting with danger. What are you planning to do? Call your daddy to come save you? Where is he? Hiding in the boat playing fisherman? Behind Ethan, Rusty chuckled, his laughter sharp as a knife slicing through the air. I like that stubborn streak of yours, Ethan, he said, stepping closer. The more stubborn you are, the more fun it is to teach you a lesson. The peace of Willow Creek had completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating, tense atmosphere. Sophie looked around, feeling the grip of the Iron Reapers tightening around her. But in that moment, she heard the distant sound of a boat engine soft, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. She recognized that sound instantly. It was her dad's boat returning from the lake. Ethan also heard it, turning his head to look into the distance, the smile on his face twisting into a grimace. Oh, looks like the old man is back, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. All right then, let's see how he teaches us to fish. Sophie gazed toward the lake, where the silhouette of James's boat slowly emerged through the mist. He stood at the bow, his demeanor calm as always, but there was something in his eyes that sent a shiver down her spine, not out of fear, but a strange feeling, as if a storm was approaching that no one else could see. James Miller's small fishing boat sliced through the thin mist on Willow Creek, the steady hum of the engine like the heartbeat of an old friend. Sophie stood on the wooden dock, her hands tightly gripping the rope, her eyes fixed on the silhouette of her father gradually becoming clearer. He stood at the bow of the boat, his broad shoulders slightly hunched with age, his hands firmly on the wheel with a calmness she had seen 1,000 times before. But today, there was something different, not in the way he stood, but in the air around him, as if the surface of the lake was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ethan Crow, the leader of the Iron Reapers, turned fully around, his cold eyes narrowing as he watched the boat approach. He crossed his arms over his chest, his boots tapping lightly on the wooden dock, as if to mark his territory. "So the old man has decided to show himself," he said, his voice deep and laced with sarcasm. "I thought he was planning to hide underwater for good." Sophie didn't respond. Her heart raced, not because of Ethan's taunts, but because she knew her dad wasn't the type to stand by while their home port was threatened. She glanced at Rusty, the muscular guy blocking her path to the port office. He smirked, hands stuffed in his pockets, as if he were watching a great show. The other members of the Iron Reapers were tightening their circle, their eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and disdain. For them, this was just a game they were sure they would win. James skillfully maneuvered the boat into the dock, his movements quick and precise, as if he had done this 1,000,000 times before, and he really had. He stepped onto the wooden pier, his old boots thudding against the floor with a steady, reassuring sound. He wore a faded flannel shirt and frayed jeans at the cuffs, looking just like an ordinary fisherman returning from an early trip. But Sophie noticed something that the Iron Reapers didn't. His eyes, usually gentle and warm, now sparkled with sharpness, like a lake reflecting the sky before a storm. "Sophie," James called, his voice deep and calm as always. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" Before Sophie could respond, Ethan interjected, stepping closer to James with an arrogant demeanor. "All good," he sneered, arms wide open as if inviting a challenge. "Absolutely, old man. We're just teaching your girl a few lessons about how the world works. I'm sure you'd like to join in too, right?" James paused, his eyes scanning Ethan, then Rusty and the others, as if he were memorizing each face, each position. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there with his hands hanging loosely at his sides. But Sophie knew that the way he stood wasn't weakness, it was readiness. She had seen him like this once before, many years ago, when a drunken guy at the local bar tried to pick a fight with Tom Grayson. In that moment, with just a few swift moves, James had the guy flat on the floor, without uttering a single word. "This is my harbor." James finally spoke up, his voice steady but carrying a strange weight. "What are you doing here?" Ethan burst out laughing, his laughter echoing across the still water. "Your harbor?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "Listen up, old man. Everything here now belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it. And I don't see you looking very strong at all." Rusty stepped forward, his hands leaving his pockets, clenched into fists as if ready to pounce. "Who does this old man think he is?" he growled, his eyes filled with defiance. "A fisherman trying to teach us how to live?" Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to scream, to warn her dad to be careful, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew James wasn't the type to show off or be aggressive, but she also knew he would never back down when the family was threatened. She glanced over at the office, where Tom Grayson was still holding the phone, his face pale with worry. She hoped he had managed to call someone, the police, or anyone who could help them get away from this crowd. James didn't respond right away. He just looked at Ethan, then at Rusty, his gaze moving slowly, as if he were weighing something that no one else could understand. "I asked you to leave," he said, his voice still calm, but now carrying a hint of firmness. "This is your last chance." Ethan tilted his head, the smile on his face fading away, replaced by a cold glare. "Last chance," he repeated, his voice dropping, more dangerous. "Old man, don't you see how things are here? There are 5 of us, just you alone, and this girl doesn't count for anything. What do you think you can do?" He raised his hand for silence, and immediately the rest of the Iron Reapers moved in closer, surrounding Sophie and James so tightly that she felt the air thicken around her. A small guy with messy hair and a name tag that read Spike pulled a chain from his belt, letting it swing in his hand like a silent threat. Rusty let out a loud laugh, his laughter ringing out like metal clashing together. "Do you see it now, old man?" Ethan said, stepping closer to James, close enough that they were only a few feet apart. "This isn't your game. This is our world. And in this world, the strong take everything." James stood still. He was there, hands hanging loosely at his sides, his face expressionless. But Sophie noticed a subtle shift in his posture. His shoulders were a bit straighter, his legs shifted slightly apart, as if he was bracing himself for something. She felt her heart pounding, partly out of fear, but also because she knew her dad wasn't the kind of man who would let them hurt her without fighting back. "Your world, huh?" James said, his voice soft but with a sharp edge lurking beneath. "Well, you picked the wrong place to prove that." Ethan frowned, his confidence faltering for a moment. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who looked as unthreatening as James. "What did you just say?" he growled, his hand clenching into a fist. But before Ethan could do anything, another sound echoed a distant police siren, faint but enough to make everyone freeze. Sophie let out a sigh of relief, her eyes lighting up with hope. Tom must have called the sheriff. But Ethan just scoffed, turning to look at her with a cruel gaze. "Don't celebrate just yet, little sister," he said. "The police are still miles away. By the time they get here, we'll be done with our business." He turned back to James, raising his hand to signal the gang. "Take care of this old man first," he ordered, his voice as cold as ice. "Let's see how long he can keep talking tough." Rusty and Spike stepped forward, their smiles turning more menacing. Sophie screamed, "Dad!" But James simply raised his hand to signal her to be quiet, his gaze never leaving Ethan. In that moment, the air in Willow Creek became suffocating, the tension so thick it felt like it could explode. The peaceful dawn had completely vanished, giving way to a storm that none of the Iron Reapers could foresee. The atmosphere at Willow Creek Harbor was heavy, like the sky before a storm. The distant wail of a police siren lingered somewhere, but was too faint to offer any comfort to Sophie Miller. She stood on the wooden dock, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze fixed on her father, James Miller, who faced the Iron Reapers as if they were just a bunch of difficult boat renters. Ethan Crow, the gang leader, had just ordered his goons to take care of this old man, and now Rusty and Spike were advancing, their eyes glinting with a mix of malice and excitement. But James stood there unmoving, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his face expressionless like a rock in the rushing water. Sophie screamed, "Dad," but her voice was drowned out by Ethan's mocking laughter. He crossed his arms, tilting his head as he looked at James with disdain. "Old man, you better pray your mouth doesn't get you killed too quickly," he said, his voice low and cold as steel. "We like to play a little longer." Rusty, the muscle-bound guy with hands as big as gun grips, stepped up first. He clenched his fists, the sound of his knuckles cracking echoing in the quiet space. "You hear me, old man?" he growled, moving closer to James. "Who do you think you are, giving orders to us?" Spike, the scrawny guy with a chain dangling in his hand, let out a low, mocking laugh, swinging the chain like a snake ready to strike. To them, James was nothing more than a frail old fisherman, an easy target for them to toy with before they ripped apart Willow Creek piece by piece. But Sophie knew her father was not an ordinary man. She had heard stories not from James himself, but from the whispers of Tom Grayson and the older folks in the village. They spoke of a different James Miller, a man who was once something greater than a fisherman, someone who had faced things that people only see in action movies. She had never truly believed those tales until now, when she saw the look in his eyes. Those eyes didn't belong to someone who was afraid or ready to give up. They were sharp, focused, as if he had witnessed this scene hundreds of times before and knew exactly what to do. James didn't respond to Rusty or Spike. He just stood there, his shoulders slightly hunched but sturdy, like an old pine tree that had weathered countless storms. When Rusty raised his fist, ready to throw the first punch, Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to rush in to do something, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the dock. And then, in a moment as quick as a blink, James moved. It wasn't a punch or a Hollywood-style dodge. It was simple, so subtle it was almost invisible. As Rusty's fist came flying in, James leaned to the side just enough for the punch to glide past his shoulder. Nothing more, nothing less. Rusty lost his balance, stumbling forward, and James reached out, lightly touching the guy's elbow, giving just a little extra push to send Rusty crashing down onto the dock. A loud thud echoed as his face hit the floor, followed by a pained groan. The whole harbor suddenly fell silent, with only the gentle lapping of the waves and Rusty's heavy breathing breaking the stillness. Ethan frowned. The smile on his face vanished. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, squinting at James as if trying to figure out what just happened. Spike, still holding the chain in his hand, hesitated for a moment before charging forward, swinging the chain toward James's head with deadly speed. But James did the unexpected. He stepped forward, closing the distance so quickly that Spike couldn't react in time. The chain whipped through the air, sliding past his shoulder, and before Spike could pull back, James had grabbed his wrist, twisting it just enough to make Spike scream in pain. The chain clattered to the wooden dock, ringing out like a warning of defeat. Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief at what she had just witnessed. Her dad, the man who usually spent his days tying ropes and teaching her how to read the clouds, had taken down two huge guys in less than 10 seconds without breaking a sweat. She glanced over at Ethan, who was now standing tall, his arms uncrossed, his eyes flashing with a mix of suspicion and anger. "Who are you?" Ethan shouted, his voice no longer laced with sarcasm but tinged with confusion. He took a step forward, but didn't dare to get any closer. No fisherman could pull off something like that. "Are you an undercover cop or something?" James didn't respond. He bent down to pick up Spike's leash, holding it in his hand as if he were inspecting an old toy, then dropped it to the floor with a soft clink. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice steady, as if he were just reminding Sophie to check the fishing net. "You didn't listen." Rusty, now able to pull himself up, clutched his aching arm and glared at James with a mix of anger and fear. You think you're a superhero or something?" he growled, his voice trembling, no longer carrying the confidence he had at the start. Spike, still holding his wrist, took a few steps back, his eyes glued to the floor, as if he couldn't bear to look directly at James anymore. Sophie felt her heart racing, but not out of fear anymore. It was a strange feeling, almost like pride. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew her father wasn't the man the Iron Reapers thought he was. He wasn't just an old fisherman. He was something bigger, something stronger, and they had just touched something they shouldn't have. Ethan clenched his fist, his gaze shifting from James to Sophie, as if weighing his next move. "You might be able to take on two of them," he said, his voice dropping, more menacing. "But you can't take on all 5 of us. Do you know math, old man? 5 against 1, you're definitely going to lose." James tilted his head slightly, and for the first time since stepping onto the dock, he broke into a small smile, not the gentle smile he usually wore, but a chilling grin, as if he'd just heard a joke that wasn't funny at all. "Quantity isn't always what matters," he said, his voice now carrying a new tone, deeper and tougher. "What's important is how you know to use it." The words hit like a stone thrown into a still pond, sending ripples spreading through the air. Ethan paused, his eyes flashing with a hint of doubt, not fear. Not yet, but a feeling that he'd just stepped into a game where he didn't know the rules. Sophie looked at her father, feeling as if she were staring at a stranger, not the James Miller who taught her how to tie knots and told stories about salmon, but someone else entirely, a person she had never truly known. From the port office, Tom Grayson still stood behind the window, his hand trembling as he held the phone. Sophie hoped he had called the sheriff, but she knew that even if they arrived, it would be too late. Everything now depended on James, and she began to realize that perhaps he had always been ready for this moment. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to his crew, who were still hesitating. "Don't just stand there like a bunch of idiots," he shouted. "Take care of it." But this time, his voice lacked the confidence it once had, and in the eyes of Rusty and Spike, Sophie saw something she never thought she would witness in the Iron Reapers. Hesitation. The hesitation in Rusty and Spike's eyes didn't escape Sophie Miller's notice. She stood there on the wooden dock of Willow Creek Harbor, feeling as if time was slowing down amidst the gentle lapping of the waves and the heavy breaths of the Iron Reapers. Ethan Crow had just shouted command, "Take him out!" But his voice no longer carried the confident arrogance it had at the start. It trembled, just a little, and that tremor spread through his gang like a small wave, enough to shake the aggressive wall they had built around her father, James Miller. James stood still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his gaze locked onto Ethan, as if he were reading every thought in the leader's mind. He showed no signs of fear or urgency. Instead, he exuded a strange calmness, like a still lake before a fierce wind sweeps in. Sophie felt her heart race, not out of worry anymore, but from a growing sense of wonder. Within her, the feeling that her dad was not just a protector in this moment, but also a mystery she had never truly understood. Ethan gritted his teeth, his hand clenched into a fist so tight that his knuckles turned white. "I said take care of him," he shouted again, his voice rising, almost desperate. He couldn't stand the way James stood there, calm and motionless, as if he were nothing in the eyes of the man. For Ethan, it wasn't just a challenge. It was a slap in the face to his pride, something he had built up over years as the leader of the Iron Reapers. Rusty, still clutching his aching arm from the earlier fall, reluctantly took a step forward. He glanced at Spike, who was still rubbing his wrist that James had twisted, then took a deep breath as if to muster some courage. "All right, old man," Rusty growled, his voice hoarse. "You want to play tough? I'll show you what tough really means." He charged forward, this time not with a fist but with both hands outstretched, aiming to slam James down the floor with his sheer muscle power. But James wouldn't let that happen. He stepped aside smoothly, almost gliding past Rusty, and in a move so quick that Sophie only caught a fleeting shadow, he grabbed the guy by the shoulder, spun him around, and shoved him hard. Rusty went crashing down again, this time slamming his back against the dock, the loud thud echoing along with a prolonged groan of pain. Spike, seeing his buddy fail once more, hurriedly picked up the chain, but the fierce look in his eyes had faded. Now, all that remained was confusion. "Get up!" Ethan shouted at Rusty, but he just lay there, gasping for breath, his face contorted in pain. He turned to Spike, growling, "What about you? Don't just stand there like an idiot. Do something." Spike raised the chain, but his hand was shaking, and before he could swing it, James spoke up. "Don't," he said, his voice deep but sharp, slicing through the air. Just one word, but it was enough to make Spike freeze, the chain in his hand coming to a halt. James turned to Ethan, his eyes now not just cold but heavy, as if he had just delivered a verdict that no one could change. "Who you think I am doesn't matter. What matters is what you're doing here, and I don't like it." Ethan laughed, but the laughter wasn't natural anymore. It was forced, almost panicked. "You think you can scare me?" he said, his voice higher than usual, and Sophie noticed something she never thought she'd see in a guy like Ethan: insecurity. He glanced at the two other goons who hadn't dared to move from the start, and signaled them to step forward. "All of you, come on. He's just an old man." The other two guys, one a scrawny dude with long, dirty hair, and the other a big guy with a snake tattoo on his neck, exchanged glances and slowly approached. They didn't seem as confident as Rusty or Spike had at first. The way James took down the other two had made them hesitate. But Ethan wasn't giving them a choice. He pointed at James and shouted, "I want to see this guy's blood on the floor." Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to scream, wanted to run to her dad, but she couldn't move. All she could do was stand there, watching James face off against all four of the men. Rusty had gotten back up, albeit slowly, showing no sign of fear. And then when the guy with the snake tattoo raised his fist, James did the unexpected. He didn't dodge or attack. He just stood there, letting the punch come closer, and then, in an instant, he tilted his head to the side, grabbed the guy's wrist, spun around, and used the guy's own force to send him crashing into the long-haired dude standing next to him. The two of them tumbled into each other, the sound of their collision echoing like a pile of toys toppling over. Rusty, seeing his chance, charged in from behind, but James turned around, lightly elbowing him in the chest, causing Rusty to drop down for the third time, gasping for breath like he was about to pass out. Ethan stood there, mouth agape, eyes wide as he took in the scene before him. Four of his henchmen, the ones he had always believed were invincible, now lay sprawled on the dock, groaning and clutching their injuries. James stood among them, his breathing steady, not a drop of sweat on his brow, as if he'd just taken a leisurely stroll around the lake instead of taking down four massive men. "Do you guys want to try again?" James asked, his voice gentle yet carrying an undeniable strength. He took a step forward, his worn boots hitting the wooden floor, and this time Ethan only took a small step back, but it was enough to show that he had lost control. Sophie looked at her dad, her heart filled with a mix of awe and pride. She had never seen him like this, not the gentle man who taught her how to fish, but someone else, someone that the Iron Reapers had just awakened. Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze darting from James to Sophie, as if he were searching for a way out of a situation he no longer understood. You're not a fisherman, Ethan whispered, his voice now just a faint, weak rasp. What the hell are you? James didn't respond right away. He just stared at Ethan, a chilling smile creeping onto his lips small, but enough to make the air around him feel heavier than ever. I am the guardian of this place, he said, his voice deep and firm. And you just picked the wrong person to mess with. Willow Creek Harbor no longer bears any trace of the peaceful dawn that Sophie Miller once cherished. The gentle lapping of the waves against the wooden dock is drowned out by the groans of the Iron Reapers, who had just been taken down by James Miller, a man they once thought was just a frail old fisherman. Rusty lies sprawled on the floor, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. Spike cradles his wrist, his eyes wide with confusion. Two others, a guy with a snake tattoo and another with long hair, struggle to get back on their feet after the ridiculous clash James just caused. And Ethan Crow, the arrogant leader, stands there with his eyes wide, his face twisted between anger and bewilderment. He just blurted out the question, "What the hell are you?" And now, James's answer, "I'm the protector of this place," hangs in the air, heavy like a sentence of doom. Sophie felt her heart racing, not out of fear anymore, but from a mix of awe and pride. She looked at her father, James Miller, standing amidst the chaos he had just created, his demeanor still calm, as if he were tying a rope on a boat. But now, she saw more clearly. He was not just a gentle dad who taught her how to fish. He was a quiet hero, a figure she had never truly understood until this moment. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned Ethan and his gang, as if waiting to see what they would do next. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to regain the control he had just lost. He stepped back, not out of fear at least, he didn't want to admit that, but because he needed time to process what had just happened. "You think you've won," he growled, his voice higher than usual, like a cornered beast. "You might have taken down 4 guys, but I'm still standing here, and I'm not going anywhere." James tilted his head slightly, the cold smile on his lips unchanged. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his voice deep and steady, as if he were talking to a stubborn child. "I gave you all a chance to walk away. You didn't listen. So now what?" Ethan clenched his fists, his eyes flashing with anger. He couldn't let himself be humiliated like this, not in front of his crew, not at a tiny dock he had planned to turn into the headquarters of the Iron Reapers. He turned to his gang, shouting, "Get up, all of you. He's just an old man. What are you afraid of?" Rusty struggled to get up, each movement seeming like a battle against his own body. He panted heavily, his eyes bloodshot with pain and anger. "I'm not afraid," he growled, but the quiver in his voice betrayed his words. Spike picked up the chain as well, though his hand trembled while holding it. The other 2 slowly stood up, their eyes avoiding James, as if he were a ghost they didn't want to confront. Sophie felt the air around her grow heavy. She glanced at her dad, wanted to say something, but his gaze signaled her to stay still. She knew he didn't want her to intervene, not because he didn't trust her, but because he had everything under control. And then, when Rusty charged again, James proved just that. The muscular guy charged in, moving slower than before, clearly in pain but still determined. He raised his fist, aiming straight for James's face. But James didn't dodge like he did last time. Instead, he took a small step forward, almost unnoticed, and used his left hand to block Rusty's punch right in midair. He twisted the guy's wrist just a bit, but it was enough to make Rusty scream in pain and drop to his knees on the floor. James didn't stop there. When Spike swung the chain from the right, he bent down, letting the chain glide over his head, then delivered a light kick to Spike's knee, sending him crashing forward, his face slamming down onto the wooden dock. The thud of Spike echoed along with Rusty's groan, creating a failed chorus that the Iron Reapers never thought they would sing. Sophie's eyes widened, her mouth agape as she watched her dad handle the 2 massive men, as if they were just a couple of rowdy kids on the playground. He didn't shout, didn't gasp for breath, showed no signs of fatigue. He simply did what needed to be done, with a terrifying precision. Ethan stood there, his hands trembling, his face now as pale as the morning mist over the lake. You're not an ordinary person," he muttered, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. He glanced at the other two guys, the one with the snake tattoo and the one with long hair, signaling them to move forward, but both just stood frozen, their eyes drifting away as if pleading with Ethan not to make them face James. James took a step forward, his old boots hitting the wooden floor with a soft thud, enough to startle Ethan. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, his voice still deep and calm. "But if you don't stop, I'm going to have to do just that. You choose." The words cut through Ethan's arrogance like a knife. He looked around at Rusty kneeling on the floor, Spike sprawled out with his face buried in his hands, and the other two standing frozen like statues, realizing that he no longer held the upper hand. But Ethan Crow was not the type to back down easily. He gritted his teeth, his hands slowly creeping down to his belt, where a heavy chain was neatly tucked away. "You want to play hardball?" he roared, his voice now laced with desperation. "Fine, I'll show you I'm not joking." He pulled out the chain, letting it swing in his hand with a sharp clink. Sophie felt her heart tighten, wanted to scream a warning to her dad, but she didn't have time. Ethan swung the chain at James, fast and hard, aiming straight for his head. But James seemed to have anticipated everything. He leaned to the side, letting the chain whip past his face by just inches. He grabbed the chain's end midair, yanked it hard, causing Ethan to lose his balance and stumble forward. Before Ethan could react, James stepped in, placed a hand on his shoulder, and gave him a gentle push that sent Ethan crashing down to the floor, the chain slipping from his grasp and clattering on the wooden dock. Sophie let out a sigh of relief, her hands trembling as she watched her dad standing there, not a scratch on him, not a drop of sweat, while Ethan sat on the floor, panting like he had just run a marathon. James looked down at him, his gaze not one of anger or contempt, but a calmness that was almost eerie. "I told you," he said, his voice soft yet firm. "You picked the wrong person to mess with." Ethan looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his face twisted in humiliation. He didn't say a word, just sat there, his hand still gripping the fallen chain, as if it were the only thing left to hold on to. Sophie stared at her dad, feeling as though she had just witnessed something far beyond the tales Tom Grayson had ever told. James Miller wasn't just her silent hero. He was a nightmare that the Iron Reapers never saw coming. Willow Creek Harbor now lay shrouded in eerie silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves and Ethan Crow's heavy breathing echoing in the tense air. The Iron Reaper's leader sat on the wooden floor, a chain slipping from his hand, his bloodshot eyes fixed on James Miller, with a mix of humiliation and confusion. James stood over him, his worn boots firmly planted on the dock, his gaze unwavering, calm and sharp, like a lake reflecting the sky before a storm. Sophie Miller, standing a few steps away, felt her heart pounding, not out of fear anymore, but in awe of the power her father had just displayed. He had taken down the entire gang of Iron Reapers without raising his voice, not breaking a sweat, as if it were just another day at the harbor. Ethan looked up, his hand gripping the chain tightly even though it was useless. You can't do this to me," he whispered, his voice trembling, as if he were trying to convince himself more than James. He glanced over at Rusty's crew, with Rusty still clutching his chest, Spike covering his face, and the other two standing frozen like statues, realizing that the world he once ruled had now crumbled at the feet of a man he had once called Old Man. James leaned down slightly, not to intimidate, but to look Ethan straight in the eye. "Don't you get it yet?" he said, his voice deep and steady, like a teacher explaining a simple lesson. "I don't want to fight. I want you all to leave. But if you force my hand, then I will do what I have to do." The word struck like a knife, slicing through the last remnants of pride that Ethan had left. He gritted his teeth, his hand trembling on the wooden floor. But he didn't get up right away. He couldn't, not because of the pain, though the fall had definitely been rough, but because of something deeper. Doubt. For the first time in his life, Ethan Crow, the undefeated leader of the Iron Reapers, felt like he was no longer the strongest person in the room, or rather, in this harbor. Sophie looked at her dad, her eyes sparkling with a fresh sense of wonder. She had always known James was special. The stories from Tom Grayson about his past weren't just tales. But now, she saw him in a completely different light. He wasn't just a protector, or the guardian of Willow Creek. He was a hero, not the flashy kind with capes and guns, but the quiet, strong kind that stands firm like a mountain in the midst of a storm. From the port office, Tom Grayson finally stepped out, his hand still gripping the old phone tightly. His face was pale, but his eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope when he saw James standing there, unyielding amidst the chaos. "James," he called, his voice trembling. "The sheriff is on the way. They're stuck because of the accident, but they'll be here soon." James nodded slightly, keeping his eyes locked on Ethan. "Thank you, Tom," he said, his voice steady. "But I think we'll be fine before they arrive." He turned to Sophie, signaling for her to come closer. "You stay right there, Sophie. It's not over yet." Ethan heard Tom's words, and a spark flashed in his eyes, not hope, but desperation. He knew the police were coming, but he also knew that if he let James win right now, the reputation of the Iron Reapers would go up in smoke. He couldn't let that happen. With one last effort, he roared, pushing himself to stand up, even though his legs trembled under the weight of his own body. "Not done yet, old man." Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. He charged at James, no longer holding the chain, just his fists in blind rage. Sophie screamed, "Dad, be careful," but James stood his ground, unflinching. He stood still, allowing Ethan to rush in close enough that she could see the bloodshot eyes of the guy before he moved. In a lightning-fast motion, James leaned to the side, grabbed Ethan's arm, and twisted hard, using his own momentum to send him crashing down again. Ethan's face slammed into the dock, a loud thud echoing along a prolonged groan of pain. James stepped forward, placing a foot lightly on Ethan's back, not to hurt him, but to keep him pinned down. "You should stop," James said, his voice now carrying a hint of sternness. "I don't want to hurt you any more than you already are, but you're making this a lot harder than it needs to be." Ethan gasped for breath on the floor, his face flushed with humiliation and pain. He pounded his hands against the wooden floor, but he had no strength left to fight back. "You can't," he mumbled, but his words came out in broken, feeble whispers, like a flame about to go out. Sophie stepped closer, her hands trembling but her eyes shining with hope. "Dad," she called, her voice soft yet firm. They can't do anything to us anymore, right?" James turned to her, the cold smile on his lips fading away, replaced by a gentle gaze that she had known since childhood. "No, Sophie," he said. "They can't. Not today." In the distance, the sound of police sirens grew louder, closer, like a promise that this nightmare was about to end. But James didn't need to wait for the police to sort this out. He looked down at Ethan, then over at the Iron Reaper sprawled out around the dock. "You can get up and walk away," he said, his voice now carrying an undeniable power. "Or you can lie there and wait for the sheriff to come and cuff each one of you. It's up to you." Rusty looked up, his face bruised and his eyes vacant. Spike let go of the chain, allowing it to drop to the floor with a weak clink. The other two, the tattooed guy and the long-haired one, exchanged glances, then slowly stood up, unable to meet James's gaze. They knew they had lost, not just in strength, but in spirit as well. Ethan, still lying at James's feet, breathed heavily, but finally, he lifted his head, his eyes flashing with a hint of lingering rage. "You think you've won, huh?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "This isn't over yet. The Iron Reapers won't forget this." James let his legs drop from Ethan's back, allowing him to sit up on his own. He looked down at the leader, his gaze no longer cold, but filled with a deep resolve. "Maybe," he said, "but today you lost. And if you come back, I'll still be here." Ethan didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands trembling, watching his underlings slowly retreat like beaten dogs. Sophie stepped forward to stand beside her father, feeling as if she had just witnessed something far greater than she could comprehend. James Miller was not just her silent hero. He was the nightmare of his enemies and the beacon of Willow Creek Harbor in this storm. The sound of the police siren echoed more clearly in the chilly air of Willow Creek Harbor, the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the early morning fog, signaling the imminent arrival of the sheriff. But on the wooden dock, James Miller didn't need to wait for anyone to confirm that he had complete control of the situation. Ethan Crow, the leader of the Iron Reapers, sat on the floor, his hands trembling, his face twisted in humiliation and anger. His gang members, Rusty, Spike, and two others stood scattered around the dock, their eyes vacant, stripped of the fierce bravado they once wore, thinking they were invincible. Sophie Miller stood beside her father, her eyes shining with faith and pride, even though her heart raced from everything she had just witnessed. James had taken down the entire Iron Reapers gang without breaking a sweat, and now he stood there like an undefeated guardian of this harbor. James looked down at Ethan, his gaze no longer cold like during their fight, but transformed into a deep calm, like a lake after a storm. "You say this isn't the end," he said, his voice low and steady, echoing Ethan's final threat. "But I think you should reconsider. What you just did threatens my daughter. Threatens this place. It's not strength. It's weakness." Ethan looked up, his bloodshot eyes flashing with fury, but he didn't respond right away. He panted heavily, his hand gripping the fallen chain tightly, as if it were the last thing keeping him from completely falling apart. "What do you know about power?" he growled, his voice hoarse with pain and humiliation. "You're just a lucky old man. The Iron Reapers will be back, and this time you won't get away." James tilted his head slightly, a small smile appearing on his lips, not one of disdain, but rather a strange patience, as if he had heard these words hundreds of times before. "You think strength is about shouting loudly, hitting hard, and making others afraid," he said, his voice steady yet carrying an undeniable weight. "But that's not real strength. True strength is knowing when to hold back, knowing how to protect what matters, and not needing to prove anything to anyone." James's words fell like small stones on the surface of the still lake, creating ripples that spread to the minds of everyone on the dock. Sophie felt her heart tremble, not because of her father's actions, but because of the meaning behind those words. She glanced at Ethan, then at Rusty and Spike, and realized they were listening too, even if they might not want to admit it. There was something in James's voice that wasn't a threat, wasn't arrogance, but a simple truth that they couldn't ignore. Ethan chuckled, but the laugh was forced, lacking the vitality it once had. "You talk a good game, old man," he mocked, trying to regain some of the pride he had lost. "But I don't need your lecture. I live by my own rules. The strong take it all, and the weak just have to shut up and endure. That's how the world works." James took a step forward, his worn boots hitting the wooden floor with a soft thud, enough to startle Ethan. He leaned down, locking eyes with the leader, and this time his voice had a sharper edge. "The world you're talking about isn't the only world," he said. "You think you're strong because you can threaten others, because you have this gang following you. But look around, they're standing there, not out of respect for you, but out of fear. That's not strength. That's a cage you've locked yourself in." Ethan paused, his gaze sweeping over Rusty, Spike, and the other two guys. Rusty hung his head, avoiding eye contact with him. Spike still clutched his wrist, his eyes vacant, as if he were trying to forget what had just happened. The other two stood still, their shoulders slumped, stripped of the aggression they had just displayed when they mocked James a few minutes ago. Sophie realized what Ethan was starting to see. The Iron Reapers were no longer a united front. They had been shaken not just by fists, but by James's calm demeanor and his words. "You can keep living like this," James continued, his voice now softer, like a father giving advice. "You can keep wandering around threatening others, thinking that fear is power. But then you'll realize that when no one's afraid of you anymore, you have nothing left. True strength doesn't come from destruction. It comes from building, from protecting what you cherish, from helping those who need you." Sophie felt a sting in her eyes. She had never heard her father speak words like these, not because he didn't believe in them, but because he had always lived that way without needing to explain. But now, standing amidst the shattered Iron Reapers, he was teaching them and her a lesson she knew she would never forget. Ethan sat there, his breath slowing down, his hands hanging limply on the floor. He didn't respond, but his gaze was no longer fierce. It was empty, as if James's words had pierced a hole in the proud wall he had built around himself. Rusty looked up, regarding James with a different expression, not anger, but curiosity, as if he were wondering whether what the man said was true. Spike released his grip from his aching wrist, his eyes shifting from Ethan to James, then back again, as if he were wrestling with himself. From the port office, Tom Grayson stepped closer, his voice trembling but filled with determination. "James," the sheriff just called back. "They'll be here in 5 minutes. Are you okay?" James nodded, keeping his eyes locked on Ethan. "I'm fine, Tom," he said. "But these people aren't. They need to reconsider what they're doing." Ethan finally stood up, his legs trembling, but he tried to maintain a tough exterior. "You think you can teach me how to live?" he growled, but his voice was now weaker, like a flame about to go out. "Iron Reapers don't need your empty words. I'll be back, and this time—" "No," James interrupted, his voice suddenly firm, causing Ethan to pause. "You're not going back. Not because I'll stop you, though I would if it came to that, but because you'll realize that what you call power brings nothing but trouble. Look at your people. They're not following you anymore. They're wondering if there's another way to live." Ethan turned his crew, and this time he clearly saw what James had meant. Rusty hung his head, saying nothing. Spike took a step back, as if he wanted to leave the dock right then and there. The tattooed guy and the long-haired one exchanged glances, their eyes filled with doubt. They were no longer the hunting wolves. They were men who had just been awakened from a dream of power they once believed to be real. James stepped back, standing next to Sophie, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not here to destroy you," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of gentleness. "I'm here to protect my daughter, to protect this place. But if you want, I can show you another way away that doesn't involve living in fear or violence." Sophie looked up at her dad, feeling like he had just opened a door she never knew existed. She glanced over at Ethan, who now stood still, his hands hanging limply by his sides, his gaze lost. The sound of the police sirens was now close enough to shake the dock, and the flashing red and blue lights pierced through the pine trees, signaling the end of this confrontation. But Sophie knew that what her dad had just done was more than just defeating the Iron Reapers. He had planted a seed, an idea about true strength in their minds. Ethan turned his back, not saying another word, but the way he walked away slowly and heavily showed that he was no longer the proud leader who had stepped into Willow Creek. Rusty and Spike watched him, then looked at James, their eyes wavering between anger and something new that could be hope, even if just a tiny spark. James stood there beside Sophie, his gaze following them, not with hostility, but with the patience of someone who knows that the real lesson doesn't end here. The sound of the police sirens blared as they came to a halt in the parking lot, and the silhouette of the chief of police emerged through the mist. But Sophie knew deep down that her father had changed everything before they arrived. James Miller was not just her quiet hero. He was the one who had just taught the Iron Reapers a lesson they would carry with them forever, whether they admitted it or not. The red and blue lights of the police cars illuminated Willow Creek Harbor, cutting through the early morning fog, accompanied by the wailing sirens as a declaration that the nightmare was over. James Miller stood on the dock, his hand gently resting on Sophie's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the Iron Reapers while the sheriff and his deputy stepped out of the vehicle, hands poised on their holsters. Ethan Crow, the once arrogant leader, now stood there with slumped shoulders, his eyes vacant, devoid of the aggression that once threatened revenge. Rusty, Spike, and two others, a tattooed guy with a snake and a long-haired guy, were scattered around the dock, heads bowed low, like shadows fading under police lights. Sophie felt the air lighten, but she knew that what her father had just done was more than just defeating these men. He had sown a seed, a glimmer of hope, in their minds. Sheriff Wilson, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a deep, warm voice, stepped closer to James, his gaze sweeping over the scattered Iron Reapers before landing on his old friend. "James," he called, his tone a mix of surprise and relief. "Looking at this scene, I guess you don't need us much, huh?" James smiled softly, the gentle smile that Sophie had known since she was a child. "I'm just keeping everything steady, Tom," he said, his voice steady. "But I think these folks need a place to reflect." Wilson nodded and turned to the Iron Reapers. "All right, you guys," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Stand up, put your hands up. We're going to take a short trip to the station." The deputy stepped forward, cuffing Ethan first, then Rusty and Spike. The other two didn't resist. They simply extended their hands behind their backs, as if they had accepted their fate. Sophie looked at her dad, her eyes sparkling with a question she hadn't dared to voice. "Dad," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, What's going to happen to them now? James turned to her, his eyes gentle yet tinged with a hint of contemplation. They will be taken away, he said. But that doesn't mean it's the end for them. Sometimes, people need to hit rock bottom to realize they can climb back up. Before Sophie could ask anything more, a hoarse voice rang out from Ethan, now handcuffed and being led to the police car. "You think you've won, don't you?" he growled, but his voice was weaker than ever, like a breeze blowing through a pile of ashes. "You can lock me up, but the Iron Reapers won't forget this." James stepped closer to Ethan, not to threaten him, but to look him straight in the eye. "I don't want to beat you," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "I want you to see that you don't have to live like this. You can do something better. Every one of you can." Ethan scoffed, but the laugh lacked any real life. "Better?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who do you think I am? Some guy in a straw hat fishing like you?" James didn't respond right away. He looked at Ethan, then at Rusty and Spike, his gaze sweeping over each of them as if searching for something deep within. "I used to be a soldier," he said, his voice now carrying a new weight, a truth that Sophie had never heard him say directly. "I once thought that strength was about fighting, about winning at any cost. But I've learned that true strength is knowing when to stand up for what's right, not to destroy, but to build." The words made Ethan pause, if only for a moment. Rusty looked up, his eyes flashing with curiosity. Spike turned away, but Sophie noticed his shoulders tremble slightly, as if James's words had touched an old wound. From the police car, Chief Wilson listened, his eyes lighting up with understanding. He knew James's past, even if he never spoke of it. "A soldier?" Rusty spoke up, his voice raspy yet tinged with a hint of surprise. "You mean you were in the military?" James nodded slightly. "Navy," he said simply. "Retired a long time ago. But what I learned never leaves me." Sophie felt her heart racing. She knew her father had served with Tom Grayson, who had shared vague stories about it, but hearing him speak directly, with that sincerity, was something entirely different. She glanced over at the Iron Reapers, and for the first time, she saw them not just as ruthless fighters. They were lost men who might have once had a past like her father's, but had chosen a different path. Sheriff Wilson stepped forward and placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You're still the best I've ever known," he said, his voice warm. "But let us handle this now. These guys need some time in jail to think things over." James nodded, stepping back to let the deputy officers lead the Iron Reapers to the van. But before Ethan got into the vehicle, he turned back, his gaze locking with James's one last time. "You think I'm going to change because of your cheesy words?" he said, his voice weak, but still trying to sound tough. "You're wrong." James didn't respond right away. He just looked at Ethan, his gaze not one of anger or challenge, but of deep patience. "I don't need you to change right now," he said, "but I know you'll think about this. And when you do, you'll see there's another way." Ethan didn't say anything more. He was shoved into the car, the door slamming shut. But Sophie noticed the way he bowed his head wasn't out of fear. It was because something was stirring inside him. Rusty and Spike also got into the car, their eyes passing over James with strange silence, as if they were carrying his words into the darkness ahead. As the police car rolled away, taking the Iron Reapers with it, Sophie stepped closer to her dad. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked, her voice soft but full of hope. James turned to her, a gentle smile returning to his face. "Not everyone," he said, "but a few will. Sometimes, people just need a chance to see who they can be, not who someone tells them they should be, but who they choose to be." Sophie nodded, feeling like she had just learned something greater than what she had witnessed at the harbor today. From the office, Tom Grayson stepped out, his face now lit up with a relieved smile. "James, what the hell did you just do?" he asked, his voice tinged with a bit of astonishment. "I've never seen anyone handle a bunch of thugs like that without breaking a sweat." James chuckled softly, patting Tom on the shoulder. "It's just about keeping everything steady, Tom," he said. "But I think they won't forget today anytime soon." Sophie gazed out at the lake, where the early sunlight began to break through the mist. The Iron Reapers were gone, but she knew that the journey of both them and her father was far from over. James hadn't just defended Willow Creek. He had opened a door for the lost, a chance for them to make amends, whether they realized it now or not. And she understood that, deep down, the seeds he planted today would sprout not through violence, but through hope. If you feel moved by the journey from darkness to light of these lost souls, please hit like and subscribe to the channel right now, as your support is a motivation for us to keep telling stories that touch the heart. Thank you. The surface of Willow Creek sparkled under the early morning sun, rays of light piercing through thin mist, bringing a sense of peace that Sophie Miller thought she had lost forever just a moment ago. The sound of a police car faded away, taking the Iron Reapers Ethan, Crow, Rusty, Spike, and 2 others into fog, leaving the dock in an eerie silence. James Miller stood there, his hand still gently resting on Sophie's shoulder, his gaze following the last car as it disappeared behind the pine trees. Sheriff Wilson had left with his team, but not before giving James one last reassuring pat on the back, accompanied by a meaningful look that Sophie didn't fully grasp. Tom Grayson stood near the harbor office, arms crossed over his chest as if he had just escaped a nightmare. But the smile on his face showed that he knew everything was going to be all right. Sophie looked up at her dad, her eyes sparkling with curiosity mixed with admiration. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but steady, "what you just told them about true strength, about change, do you really believe they can do it? After everything they've done?" James turned to her, the familiar gentle smile returning to his lips, but his eyes held a deep contemplation. "Not everyone will change, Sophie," he said, his voice warm like the waves lapping at the shore. "But I believe there's a good part in everyone, no matter how buried it may be. Sometimes they just need someone to show them that they have a choice, not to force them, but to help them discover it for themselves." Sophie nodded slowly, her gaze drifting over the surface of the lake, where the sunlight had now completely chased away the fog. Her father's words echoed in her mind, not just a lesson for the Iron Reapers, but something bigger perspective on life she had never considered before. She recalled the look in Rusty's eyes when he mentioned being a soldier, the flicker of uncertainty in Spike's gaze when he spoke of true strength. Something had shifted in them, even if just a tiny bit, and she began to believe that her father wasn't just protecting the harbor today. He had planted a seed that could grow into something much greater. Tom Grayson stepped closer, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, his voice still a bit shaky but filled with gratitude. "James, what the hell did you just do?" he asked, but the smile on his face showed he didn't really need an answer. "I've seen you handle those drunks at the bar, but you're a whole different person." James chuckled softly, patting Tom on the shoulder like he always did when they were younger. "It's just about keeping everything steady, Tom," he said, his voice gentle. "But I'm not doing this alone. Sophie's here. You're here, we're a team." Sophie smiled, a warm feeling spreading in her heart as she heard her dad mention her as part of this fight. She wasn't out there battling like he was, but she stood strong, holding the spirit, and that meant more to him than she ever realized. She glanced over at Tom, who was now looking at James with a mix of awe and respect. "You know," Tom said, "I always knew you were a Navy SEAL, but seeing you act like this, it takes me back to when you first came home. You never talk much about it, but I know you've seen things we can't even imagine." James didn't respond right away. He gazed out at the lake, his eyes distant, as if he were recalling days he rarely spoke of. "I don't like talking about that," he finally said, his voice deeper. "But what I learned in the military wasn't just how to fight. It was about how to live, how to protect, how to stand firm for what matters, and how to give others a chance to do the right thing." Sophie felt her heart race. She had never heard her dad talk so much about his past like this, and every word he said felt like a piece of a puzzle slowly revealing his true self. She thought about Ethan, about the way he hung his head before being taken away in the police car, and wondered if her dad was right. Was there a part of him, of all of them, that was still good, just waiting to be awakened? "So what now, James?" Tom asked, his voice calmer now. "Do you really think the Iron Reapers would just let this slide? Ethan's not the kind of guy who forgets easily." James turned back, his gaze steady. "They might come back," he said, "but next time they won't be like today. I don't think all of them want to live like this, threatened, beaten, living in fear. Some of them, I see it in their eyes. They're wondering if there's another way." Sophie recalled Rusty's gaze, not angry but curious, as if he were pondering what James had said. She remembered how Spike had trembled when he mentioned true power, as if he were wrestling with an old memory. "Who do you think will change?" she asked, her voice soft yet filled with hope. "Ethan? Or Rusty?" James smiled, a light yet meaningful smile. "Not yet, Ethan," he said. "He's too stubborn, too proud. But Rusty, and maybe Spike, there's something in them, a part that this life hasn't completely extinguished. They used to be someone before joining the Iron Reapers, and I think they're just starting to remember that." Sophie nodded, feeling as if she had just stepped into a world she had never known, a world where her dad was not just her hero, but also someone who could change even those like the Iron Reapers. She looked out at the harbor, where the traces of the confrontation still lingered, the chain of Spike, the scratches on the wooden floor, but now they were no longer memories of violence. They were signs of a new beginning, an opportunity that James had given them. Tom clapped his hands, breaking the silence. "Come on, you two," he said, his tone more cheerful. "We've got all day to clean up this mess, and I think we deserve a cup of coffee after what just happened." James laughed heartily, his laughter ringing out like a gentle melody in the peaceful air. "I hear you, Tom," he said, then turned to Sophie. "What do you think, sweetheart? Coffee and then back to work." Sophie smiled, feeling like everything had returned to its rhythm, but even better than before. "Sure, Dad," she said, "but I think today is going to be a long day." The early sunlight bathed Willow Creek harbor in a brilliant golden hue, dispelling the thin mist and bringing a sense of peace that Sophie Miller never thought would return after the chaotic morning. She walked alongside her father, James Miller, and Tom Grayson, heading toward the harbor office to brew a cup of coffee, a small reward they allowed themselves after Sheriff Wilson had taken care of the Iron Reapers. The gentle lapping of the waves against the dock blended with the cheerful chirping of birds in the towering pines, as if nature was trying to erase the remnants of the recent violence. But Sophie knew the story wasn't truly over, not with Ethan Crow's final threat hanging in the air, and not with the seeds of hope her father had planted in those people's minds. As soon as they stepped into the office, the phone rang, breaking the quiet atmosphere. Tom quickly picked up the receiver, his face briefly tense before relaxing into a light smile. "It's Wilson," he said, handing the receiver to James. "He wants to talk to you." James picked up the phone, his voice steady as always. "Tom, is something wrong?" Sophie stood nearby, hanging on every word, feeling her heart race as she heard the chief of police's deep voice come through the speaker that Tom had turned on. "James, I just got word from a source inside the Iron Reapers," Wilson said, his voice tinged with worry. "Ethan isn't joking around. He called his goons before they cuffed him, a guy named Jake Razor Hensley, his right-hand man. Razor is rounding up the rest of the crew, at least 20 of them, and they're on their way to Willow Creek right now. They want revenge, James, and they won't hold back." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at her dad, but James showed no signs of panic. He simply nodded slightly, his gaze sharpening just like when he faced Ethan at the dock. "When will they arrive?" he asked, his voice so calm it was almost unsettling. Wilson sighed on the phone. "Maybe in about 2 hours, if they hurry. I'm calling in more people from a neighboring county, but we only have 6 deputies here. If Razor brings a whole crew, we'll be outnumbered." James set the receiver down, his gaze sweeping over Sophie and Tom. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but firm. "They want to turn this place into a battleground to prove something, but we're not going to let them do that." Sophie swallowed hard, her voice trembling, but she tried to stay strong. "Dad, what do you mean? What are we going to do? Fight against 20 people?" James smiled gently, placing his hand on her shoulder to reassure her. "No, Sophie," he said. "We're not going to fight like they do. We will stand together, not just for Dad, but for all of Willow Creek. This isn't just about our family. This is home for everyone here." Tom frowned, but his eyes lit up as he grasped James's idea. "Are you planning to call the whole village?" he asked, his tone tinged with surprise. "I mean, we have a few people who know how to handle a gun, but most are just fishermen and dock workers." "That's right," James replied, his voice now carrying a newfound strength. "But they don't need to be soldiers. They just need to be themselves, people ready to protect this place. I've seen it in the military, Tom. The power doesn't lie in weapons or numbers. It lies in the people standing together. The atmosphere in the office suddenly grew tense, but not out of fear. It was a rising sense of determination. Sophie felt her heart racing, not from anxiety, but because she was starting to believe in her father's plan. James stepped out of the office, signaling for her and Tom to follow. "We need everyone," he said, "starting from the docks, then to the village. I'll call a few old friends." Within an hour, Willow Creek Harbor became the center of an unprecedented movement. James stood on the main dock, his voice ringing clear as he spoke to the crowd gathering fishermen with calloused hands, shop owners from the village, and even the everyday folks that Sophie had known since she was a child. He wasn't shouting or barking orders. He was simply recounting the events of this morning, how the Iron Reapers had come to threaten him, how he had defended this place, and how they were coming back to try again. "This isn't just my harbor," James said, his gaze sweeping over each face. "This is our home. If we let them take that away, we'll lose more than just a piece of land. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm asking you to stand up together so they see that Willow Creek is not a place they can invade." His words were like a breeze sweeping through the crowd, igniting a fire in Sophie that she had never seen in these people before. Old Man Ben, a seasoned fisherman with a head of white hair, raised his stick high. "I won't let those bastards ruin my dock," he growled, his voice raspy but filled with determination. "I'll stand here with you, James." Mary, the bakery owner in the village, stepped up with her hands on her hips. "They came into my shop demanding protection money," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "If you need someone, I'll bring my frying pan out." Laughter erupted in the crowd, but it quickly turned into applause as more and more voices joined in. Sophie felt her eyes welling up, not out of fear, but because she realized that her dad was not just her hero. He had inspired all of Willow Creek to rise up, not through force, but through the courage they had forgotten they possessed. James didn't stop there. He pulled out his phone, making brief but meaningful calls. Sophie heard him say things like, "I need you here, Mike," or "It's been a while, but Willow Creek needs us." She didn't know all the people he was calling, but the way he spoke, with such certainty and no doubt, made her believe they would come. Before long, old trucks began to appear in the parking lot of the port. Tall, sturdy men stepped out, their sharp eyes like James. They weren't in uniform, but Sophie recognized them immediately. They were veterans, old friends of her dad from his days in the Navy. One man with short silver hair clapped James on the shoulder, laughing heartily. "You're still causing trouble like you used to, huh, Miller?" he said, his voice warm and deep. "But I'm not missing out on this one." Sophie stood there, watching as Willow Creek transformed into a fortress not built of bricks and stones, but of people. Fishermen armed with rods and nets, villagers fueled by determination, and veterans bringing the experience they once used to defend their country. James stood among them, not as a general giving orders, but as a neighbor, a friend, a father who had given him a reason to rise up. As the sun began to rise higher, Sophie heard the distant sound of a motorcycle engine, faint at first, but growing closer. She looked at her dad, and James gave a slight nod. "They're coming," he said, his voice calm yet sharp. "But this time, they won't see just one person standing alone. They'll see all of Willow Creek." Sophie felt her heart pounding, but not out of fear, rather, out of pride. She held her father's hand, standing beside him as the crowd tightened their formation. The Iron Reapers might come with numbers and weapons, but they had no idea they were about to face a much greater force. The unity of a community ready to defend their home. The roar of a motorcycle engine echoed from afar, slicing to the tranquil air of Willow Creek Harbor, each pulse of sound striking like a hammer against the peace that had just settled. Sophie Miller stood beside her father, James Miller, on the wooden dock, her hand tightly gripping his, her heart pounding as the first headlights peeked through the pine trees. The crowd behind them, fishermen, villagers, and James's old veteran buddies, tightened their formation, not a word spoken, but their eyes shone with determination Sophie had never seen before. James stood firm like a rock in the rushing water, his gaze sharp yet calm, fixed on the dirt road leading into the harbor. "They're coming," he said, his voice deep and steady, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The headlights grew brighter, and then, Like a pack of wolves bursting from the shadows, 24 motorcycles appeared, their tires crunching over gravel, creating a harsh, jarring sound. Leading the pack was Jake Razor Hensley, a wiry man radiating danger with a scarred face and eyes as cold as steel. He was the first to stop, cutting the engine and leaving behind a heavy silence that replaced the earlier roar. The rest of the Iron Reapers, a group of men clad in jet-black leather adorned with patches resembling venomous snakes, spread out behind him, wielding bats, chains, and a few things that looked like guns hidden beneath their jackets. Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat, but James's grip kept her steady. Razor stepped out of the car, his boots thudding against the ground as his gaze swept over the crowd before landing on James. "Miller," he called, his voice rough and icy. "Who the hell do you think you are, messing with Ethan? You humiliated the Iron Reapers, and now you're going to pay for this entire damn village too." James didn't respond right away. He took a step forward, his worn boots thudding against the wooden floor. His gaze locked onto Razor, as if he were reading every thought in the guy's head. "What are you here to prove?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "That you're stronger? That you can destroy this place? Look around, you're not just facing me." Razor sneered, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Old Man Ben with his cane, Mary with her frying pan, the veterans standing tall like statues, and his smile twisted into a grimace. "What do you call this ragtag bunch? An army?" he mocked, raising his hand to signal his goons to move forward. "You might take down Ethan, but you can't take me on. 20 guys, Miller. You don't stand a chance." Sophie felt the air around her thicken, tense to the point of being suffocating. She looked at her dad, waiting to see if he would fight like he did this morning or call Sheriff Wilson back. But James didn't do either. He just stood there, his gaze locked on Razor, and then he spoke, his voice ringing out like a declaration in the storm. "You're wrong," he said. "This isn't about fighting. This is about you choosing the wrong opponent. Not just me, but all of Willow Creek." The words hit like a gust of wind to the crowd, igniting a fire of determination that Razor never saw coming. Old Man Ben stepped forward, his cane raised high. "You want this, Doc?" he growled, his voice rough yet powerful. "You'll have to get through me first." Mary moved up beside him, the frying pan in her hand glinting in the sunlight. "And me too," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger but filled with courage. The cheers erupted from the crowd, not in unison, but as individual voices blending into a powerful chorus of courage. Sophie felt her eyes welling up, not from fear, but because she realized that her father had accomplished the unimaginable. He had turned Willow Creek into a family, ready to stand up against the darkness. Razor frowned, his confidence faltering for a moment as he saw the crowd refusing to back down. James stepped closer, his voice now carrying a sharp edge. "You can attack," he said, "but you won't win. Not because we're stronger in numbers or weapons, but because we have each other. You want to destroy this place? You'll have to destroy all of us." Razor gritted his teeth, his hand tightening around the club he held. "You think I'm scared of these guys?" he roared, his voice higher than usual, like a cornered beast. He turned to his crew, shouting, "Get in there! Take care of these guys for me." The Iron Reapers advanced, chains and clubs raised high. But Sophie noticed something that Razor didn't. They weren't as aggressive as they had been at first. A few of them hesitated, their eyes scanning the crowd with uncertainty. James raised his hand, signaling for everyone to hold their ground. "Don't fight unless they force us to," he said, his voice ringing out like a gentle command. "We're here to protect, not to attack." Razor charged in first, his club swinging toward James with terrifying speed. Sophie screamed, "Dad!" But James was ready. He leaned to the side, letting the club whoosh past him, then grabbed Razor's wrist, twisting hard, sending the guy crashing to the floor. A loud thud echoed, and in that moment, Willow Creek erupted into a sea of emotion, not violence, but unity. The thud when Jake Razor Hensley hit the wooden floor of Willow Creek dock rang out like a bell, waking everything around. Sophie Miller stood there, her breath caught in her chest, her eyes glued to her father, James Miller, who had just taken down the new leader of the Iron Reapers with a swift, decisive move. Razor lay on the floor, clutching his twisted wrist, his scarred face contorted with pain and humiliation. His crew of 20 leather-clad thugs, armed with bats and chains, froze, their gazes wavering between their initial aggression and a growing doubt. James stood firm, his worn boots thudding against the floor, his eyes never leaving Razor, but his voice remained calm as a lake after storm. "I told you," he said. "You picked the wrong opponent." The crowd behind James, fishermen, villagers, and veterans didn't rush in the fight like the Iron Reapers had expected. Instead, they stood their ground, tightly formed, their eyes shining with a determination Sophie had never seen in them before. Old Man Ben raised a staff higher, Mary tightened her grip on the frying pan, and James's fellow veterans stood tall like statues, ready but not attacking. Their silence was more powerful than any shout, like an invisible wall that the Iron Reapers couldn't break through. The Razor roared, pushing itself up with a desperate effort. "You think you've won?" he shouted, his voice hoarse yet trembling. "I'll tear this village apart piece by piece." "You mean nothing." He turned to his gang, raising his hand command. "Get in there. Don't just stand there like a bunch of idiots." But this time, none of the Iron Reapers charged in right away. A young guy with messy hair took a step back, lowering the stick in his hand. Another tall guy with a tattoo on his arm glanced at Razor, then at James, his eyes filled with doubt. Sophie realized it. They no longer believed in Razor's power. The way James stood there, fearless, not aggressive, yet seemingly invincible, had shaken their confidence. And the way the entire Willow Creek stood behind him, not with weapons, but with courage, made them question whether they were truly the strong ones in this fight. James stepped closer to Razor, his voice now carrying a surprising hint of tenderness. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Look around you. You're not leading them anymore. They don't want to fight for you. They want a reason to stop." Razor gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with anger and confusion. "What do you know about me?" he roared, but his voice was now weaker, like a flame about to go out. "I don't need them. I'll take care of you myself." He lunged forward again, pulling a small knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the sunlight. Sophie screamed, "Dad, be careful!" But James was already one step ahead. He leaned to the side, letting the blade skim past just inches from his shoulder, then seized Razor's wrist, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, ringing out, and with a gentle shove, James forced Razor to kneel down once more. The sound of his ragged breathing echoed in the stillness, and this time he didn't get back up. Sophie felt her eyes welling up, not out of fear, but because she realized this moment was not just her father's victory. It was a triumph for all of Willow Creek. James looked down at Razor, his gaze not one of anger or disdain, but of deep patience. "You can stop right now," he said, his voice low and sincere. "No one here wants you to die. We want you to see that what you call strength isn't everything." Razor looked up, his scarred face pale, his hands trembling on the wooden floor. He didn't say a word, but the way he lowered his head, even just a little, showed that James's words had struck a chord with him, even if he didn't want to admit it. Sophie glanced over at the Iron Reapers, and she saw what Razor didn't want to see. They were laying down their weapons. The young guy with the messy hair dropped his stick, the clatter echoing like a surrender. The tattooed guy on his arm stepped back, the chain in his hand falling to the floor. A few others exchanged glances, then slowly put down their weapons, not out of fear, but because they had no reason to fight anymore. James turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out clearly. "We're not here to kill them," he said. "We're here to protect our home and to show them a different way." He looked at Razor, then at the disbanding Iron Reapers. "You all can leave. Take what you've seen today with you and think about it." Silence enveloped Willow Creek Harbor, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves and the whisper of the wind through the pine trees. Razor sat there, his breath heavy, his gaze lost. Finally, he stood up, not looking at James, not looking at anyone. "Let's go," he murmured, his voice hoarse, and the remaining crew quietly turned back to their motorcycles. No one said a word, but the way they left slowly, without aggression, showed they were no longer the invincible Iron Reapers. Sophie stepped over to her dad, wrapping her arms around his arm, feeling as if her heart had just weathered a storm and was now searching for peace. "You did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. They're gone now. James smiled, placing his hand on her head. It's not just Dad, Sophie, he said. It's all of us. They didn't lose because of Dad's strength. They lost because of the strength of Willow Creek. The crowd erupted in applause, not in arrogant victory, but in the joy of those who had just defended their home. Old Man Ben raised his stick high. Mary swung her frying pan, and the veterans patted each other on the back, laughing heartily. Sophie looked at her father, feeling that he was not just her hero. He was a beacon that had guided the entire community through the darkness to an emotional climax they would never forget. The afternoon sunlight faded over Willow Creek, casting a golden hue on the still water, like a mirror reflecting everything that had just transpired. The roar of the Iron Reaper's motorcycles was now just a distant memory. A band of followers scattered under the leadership of Jake Razor Hensley, who had vanished into Pine Forest, leaving the harbor in a gentle silence that Sophie Miller had never felt so deeply before. She stood beside her father, James Miller, on the wooden dock, her hand still tightly clasped in his, feeling her heart gradually slow down after the frantic beats of the tumultuous morning and afternoon. The crowd around them, fishermen, villagers, and veterans, was still alive with laughter and applause, but it wasn't the sound of arrogant victory. It was the joy of those who had just defended their home and discovered a strength they never knew they had. James gazed out at the lake, his expression gentle yet tinged with contemplation, as if he were weighing what had just happened against what was to come. Sophie tilted her head to look at him, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Dad," she said, "they're gone. Razor and those guys, they really left. You did it, didn't you?" "We did it." James turned to her, the familiar gentle smile returning to his face. But this time, it carried a deeper meaning. "It's not just me, Sophie," he said, his voice warm like the waves lapping at the shore. "It's all of us. Willow Creek didn't win because I fought well. We won because everyone here stood up, not to destroy, but to protect." Sophie nodded, her gaze sweeping over the crowd still gathered around the dock. Old Man Ben, his cane now propped against the floor, laughed heartily with another fisherman. Mary, her skillet still glinting in the twilight, was recounting the story of how she almost hit Razor with a few villagers, their laughter ringing out like a melody. James's old Navy buddies were slapping each other on the back, their eyes shining with the quiet pride of those who had fought on real battlefields. Sophie felt her eyes welling up, not out of sadness, but because she realized that this evening was not just a victory, it was a new beginning. Tom Grayson walked over from the port office, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, a smile on his face wider than ever. "James, you know," he said, his voice tinged with a bit of astonishment. "I never thought this little port could pull off something like this. You've turned us into an army without needing any guns at all." James chuckled softly, patting Tom on the shoulder like he always did since they were young. "I'm not turning you guys into anything, Tom," he said. "You've always been this way. You just needed a reason to remember." He turned to Sophie, his eyes lighting up a bit. "And I think we just gave both Razor and the Iron Reapers a reason to reflect on themselves." Sophie furrowed her brow, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you think they'll change? I mean, Razor, he doesn't seem like the type to listen to you. He's angry, arrogant, just like Ethan." James nodded slowly, his gaze becoming distant, as if he were peering into an old memory. "Maybe not right now," he said. "Razor and Ethan, they've lived too long in a world where they think power is everything. But I've seen it in their eyes, not all of them, but a few in that crowd. They don't want to stay like this forever. They just don't know how to break free." Sophie thought back to the way the Iron Reapers laid down their weapons, not all of them, but enough to make Razor lose control. She remembered the look in the eyes of the young guy with the messy hair, the way he dropped his stick as if it was too heavy to hold any longer. She recalled the tattooed guy on his arm, his shoulders slumping as he stepped back. "Dad was right," she whispered. "There's something in them, like they want to stop, but they don't know where to begin." From the parking lot, the sound of the police car echoed again, this time not in a rush like before, but slowly, like a friendly greeting. Sheriff Wilson stepped out of the car, hands on his hips, his gaze sweeping over the harbor, now peaceful once more. "James," he called, his voice warm, "I just got word from the patrol team. Razor's crew has left the area without any fights or trouble." They headed straight south, as if they wanted nothing to do with this anymore. James nodded, showing no surprise. "Good," he said simply. "But I don't think we've seen the last of them, Tom." Wilson frowned and stepped closer. "What do you mean? Do you think they'll come back again?" "Not exactly," James replied, his voice thoughtful. "But what happened today, it's not just a battle. It's a lesson for them and for us. They'll carry it with them, whether they want to or not. And one day, some of them will come back, not to seek revenge, but to find something else." Sophie felt her heart race as she listened to her dad. She looked at him, her eyes sparkling with a question she hadn't dared to voice. "Dad," she said, "are you talking about giving them a chance? After everything they've done?" James turned to her, his gaze gentle yet firm. "Everyone deserves a chance, Sophie," he said. "Not to forgive right away, not to forget what they've done, but to let them become someone better. I've seen lost soldiers, people I thought would never turn back. But when someone gives them a path, a reason, they change. Not all of them, but enough to make it worth trying." Wilson nodded, his eyes lighting up with understanding. "You've always been like that, James," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "I remember the time you pulled that kid Harris out of trouble at the base. Everyone thought he was done for, but you saw something in him, and now he's a decent officer." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm not doing much, Tom," he said. "I'm just showing them who they can be. Today, I don't want the Iron Reapers to die or rot in prison forever. I want them to reconsider, and I think Willow Creek just gave them a reason to do that." Sophie gazed out at the lake, the evening light fading away, making room for the first stars to twinkle in the sky. She thought about Razor, about Ethan, about the guys who had once threatened this place, and wondered if her dad was right. Could they really change? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing. James Miller wasn't just protecting Willow Creek today. He had left behind a legacy not through violence, but through compassion, with a belief that even the most lost souls could find their way. Tom clapped his hands, breaking the silence. "Come on, everyone," he said cheerfully. "I think we deserve a little break. Who wants some coffee?" James laughed heartily, pulling Sophie into a gentle hug. "That sounds great, Tom," he said. "But I think we've just started something bigger than coffee." Sophie smiled, feeling like this afternoon was not just the end of a long day, but the beginning of a new story, a legacy that her father had planted, and she knew it would resonate far beyond Willow Creek. As darkness slowly descended upon Willow Creek Harbor, the twinkling stars in the sky reflected off the still lake, creating a serene picture that Sophie Miller had never truly appreciated until today. The laughter and chatter of the crowd, fishermen, townsfolk, and veterans still echoed from the wooden dock as they gathered around the harbor office, savoring the hot cups of coffee that Tom Grayson had hurriedly brewed. James Miller stood beside Sophie, holding a steaming cup of coffee, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a gentle smile. Sheriff Wilson had returned to his car, but not before whispering something to James that Sophie couldn't quite catch, accompanied by a meaningful nod. The atmosphere was no longer tense like it had been just a few hours earlier, when Razor and the Iron Reapers had left in silence. But Sophie knew that this story wasn't truly over, not for her dad, and not for what it planted in the hearts of everyone today. Sophie took a sip of her coffee, the warmth jolting her awake after a long, emotional day. She turned to her dad, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "Dad," she said, "you said they would come back not for revenge, but to find something else. What do you mean? Do you really think they'll change?" James set his coffee cup down on the edge of the nearby wooden table, his gaze becoming distant, as if he were peering into a long-buried memory he rarely shared. "I'm not sure all of them will change, Sophie," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "But I've seen it before in the military, in the lost soldiers I used to train. They're not bad to the core. They've just gotten caught up in a world they believe is the only one, a world of violence, fear, and power. When someone shows them another way, a few of them will take that path." Sophie nodded slowly, her gaze drifting over the surface of the lake, where the stars now shone brighter in the darkness. She thought about Razor, the way he had bowed his head before leaving, not out of fear, but because of something deeper that she couldn't quite name. She thought about the young man with the messy hair, the way he had dropped the stick as if it were the last burden he wanted to let go of. "But how do you know?" she asked, her voice now tinged with a hint of doubt. "They're the Iron Reapers. They survive by threatening others. How can you be sure they won't come back with knives and clubs again?" James smiled, a gentle smile, but full of meaning. "I'm not sure, Sophie," he said, "but I know one thing. When you give someone a reason to rethink, it sticks in their mind whether they like it or not. Today, we didn't just defeat them, we showed them something they never expected. A community standing together, unafraid, more peaceful than they are, that will haunt them, and one day, it might change them." Sophie felt her heart flutter as she listened to her dad. She looked at him, her eyes sparkling with a newfound understanding. She remembered how the crowd stood behind her father, Old Man Ben, with his cane, Mary with her frying pan, the veteran standing tall, and realized that it wasn't just physical strength. It was the power of belief, of unity, and of the compassion that James had instilled in them. "So what do you think will happen to them now?" she asked, her voice now carrying a hint of hope. James took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting back to the crowd laughing and chatting in the distance. "They're going to take different paths," he said. "Ethan and Razor, they'll be hard to change. They built their whole lives around the idea that power is everything. But others, like that young guy who dropped his stick, or Rusty with his curious eyes, they might find a way out. I've seen people like them in the military. They join gangs because they're lost, because they need a place to belong. Today, we're showing them another place to belong, not by dragging them in, but by letting them find their way." Sophie reflected on what her dad had told Ethan that morning about true strength, about protecting rather than destroying, and wondered if those words were echoing the minds of the Iron Reapers right now. She glanced over at Tom Grayson, who was pouring more coffee for Old Man Ben, and realized that Willow Creek hadn't just changed the Iron Reapers. It had changed them as well. "Dad," she said, her voice now more certain, "if they come back not to fight, but to find another way, what would you do?" James turned to her, his eyes lighting up a bit, as if he'd been waiting for this question. "I will welcome them," he said simply, "not as enemies, but as people who need a chance. I used to be a soldier, Sophie. I know what it feels like to be lost when you leave behind a world you thought was everything. If they want to find themselves again, I'll help them not because I have to, but because it's the right thing to do." Sophie felt her eyes stinging, not out of sadness, but because she realized that her dad was not just her hero. He was a hero to anyone willing to make a change. She thought about how he stood on the dock this morning, facing Ethan without a hint of fear, and how he led all of Willow Creek against Razor without any weapons. "Dad," she whispered, "you are the greatest man I've ever known." James laughed heartily, pulling her into a gentle hug. "No, Sophie," he said, his voice warm and deep. "You're the amazing one, and everyone here too. I'm just the one getting things started. What we're doing today will outlive me, outlive all of us." From a crowd, Old Man Ben raised his coffee cup, his voice hoarse yet cheerful. "Come on, let's raise a glass to James Miller," he shouted, and applause erupted, accompanied by laughter and cheers. Mary stepped forward, handing Sophie a fresh cup of coffee, her eyes shining with joy. "Sweetheart, your dad is a special man," she said, "but you're a part of this too. Don't forget that." Sophie smiled, feeling as if her heart had just opened a new door. She looked at her dad, who was laughing and chatting with Tom in the crowd, and realized that he was right. What happened today was not just a battle. It was a legacy of compassion, of unity, and of the belief that even the most lost souls can find the light. As darkness enveloped Willow Creek, the lights from the port office illuminated the faces of those who had stood together, and Sophie knew that this story wouldn't end here. It had only just begun, and her father's legacy would resonate far beyond what she could imagine. As night fell over Willow Creek, the lights from the port office and nearby houses cast a soft golden glow on the lake, like little lighthouses in the darkness. Sophie Miller sat on a wooden bench by the dock, holding a now-cold cup of coffee, her gaze drifting over the thinning crowd of villagers and fishermen who were starting to head home, carrying the stories of the day like trophies to share at the dinner table. James Miller stood a few steps away, chatting with Tom Grayson and a few veterans, their laughter ringing out in the cool evening air. Sophie smiled as she listened to her dad recount an old Navy tale, his voice warm and lively, as if the years of fighting had never truly left him. But inside Sophie, a fresh feeling was growing, not just pride in her dad, but a question about what would happen next. She thought about his earlier words that some of the Iron Reapers might come back, not for revenge, but to find another way. She thought about Razor, about Ethan, and wondered if they truly heard what James had said, or they would forever be stuck in the world they once thought was everything. She set her coffee cup down, stood up, and walked closer to her dad, her eyes sparkling with a curiosity she couldn't hide. "Dad," she called, her voice soft enough to interrupt James and Tom's conversation. "I keep thinking about what you said about giving them a chance. If they really do come back, not to fight, but to change, what will we do? I mean, how can we help them when they once tried to destroy this place?" James paused, turned to look at her, his eyes lighting up a bit as if he had been waiting for this question. He signaled to Tom and the other old friends to continue the story, then led Sophie to the edge of the dock, where the gentle sound of the waves created a soothing background melody. "That's a great question, Sophie," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "And the answer isn't simple. Helping them doesn't mean forgetting what they did or pretending like it never happened. It means giving them a chance to prove they can be different, not for us, but for themselves." Sophie furrowed her brow, her gaze sweeping over the lake's surface, where the lights reflected like fallen stars. "But how do we know they're serious?" she asked, her voice now tinged with a hint of doubt. "They're the Iron Reapers, Dad. They're not the kind of people who easily walk away from that life." James nodded slowly, his gaze becoming distant, as if he were recalling the faces he had encountered in the past. "I don't expect them to change overnight," he said. "But I've seen people like them before, young soldiers lost after the war, guys who think violence is the only way to survive. They don't change because someone tells them to. They change when they see a better path they can walk on their own. We can't force them, Sophie. We can only open the door." Sophie felt her heart race as she listened to her dad. She thought about how Razor had fallen to his knees on the dock, his eyes no longer fierce but empty, as if he had just lost something bigger than the battle. She thought about the young guy with the messy hair, the way he dropped his staff like he was letting go of his entire life. "So, what are we going to do if they come here?" she asked, her voice now tinged with a hint of hope. "How do we open the door?" James smiled, a gentle smile, but full of meaning. "We give them jobs," he said simply. "We give them a place to belong, not by pulling them in, but by letting them choose for themselves. Willow Creek is a community of fishermen, boat repairers, people who make a living with their hands. If they want to come back, they can work here, learn how to build instead of destroy. I've seen soldiers find themselves again through hard work. It gives them purpose, something they can't find in violence." Sophie's eyes widened, and her gaze lit up as she grasped her dad's idea. "You mean like a show?" she asked. "Like you teaching them how to fish or fix a boat?" James chuckled softly and nodded. "That could be true," he said. "Or whatever they're good at. I don't have all the answers, Sophie, but I do know one thing. When you give someone a chance to do something good, they often surprise themselves. I once saw a stubborn soldier, the toughest sniper I ever trained, become the best gardener after leaving the service. He told me that planning gave him a sense of control that a gun never did." Sophie smiled, feeling as if a grand idea had just sparked in her mind. She thought about how her dad had transformed Willow Creek into a united community in just one day, not through force, but through trust and guidance. "Dad," she said, her voice now more assured, "if we do this, if we open the door for them, then it's not just helping them. It's helping all of Willow Creek, right? I mean, we'll be stronger if we don't just stand against them, but also bring them in." James turned to her, his eyes shining with pride. "That's right, Sophie," he said. "That's exactly what I want you to see. True strength isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about turning them into friends. It's not easy and it's not without risks, but if we can pull it off, then today won't just be a victory. It will be a legacy." Sophie felt her eyes sting, not from sadness, but because she realized that her dad wasn't just talking about the Iron Reapers. He was talking about a way of life, a perspective on the world that she wanted to embrace. She looked out at the lake, where the lights in the dock now shone brightly in the darkness, and felt that Willow Creek was not just her home, it was a beacon, a place where even the most lost souls could find their way to the light. From the office, Tom Grayson called out cheerfully, "James, Sophie, are you two planning to stand there stargazing all night? Come over here. We got cake that Mary just brought." James laughed heartily and turned to Sophie. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm and deep. "We deserve to take a little break, but I think we've just started something bigger than just cake and coffee." Sophie smiled, walking alongside her dad towards the lights and laughter. She knew that tonight wasn't just the end of a long day. It was the beginning of a new journey, a legacy that James had sown with his kindness. And as she saw the smiles on the faces of the people of Willow Creek, she believed that legacy would resonate even further, reaching places she couldn't yet imagine. The lights from the Willow Creek office cast a warm glow, illuminating the beaming faces of the crowd gathered around the wooden table, where Tom Grayson had just set down a tray of pastries that Mary brought from her shop. Sophie Miller walked alongside her dad, James Miller, feeling her legs sore after a long day, but her heart was lighter than ever. The laughter and chatter of fishermen, villagers, and veterans rang out like a melody, blending with the gentle lapping of the waves on the lake, now shrouded in darkness. James grabbed a pastry, took a bite, and winked at Sophie, his voice warm with a hint of playfulness. "I told you, Sophie, this is bigger than coffee." Sophie laughed heartily, taking a pastry from Tom's hand, her eyes sparkling with joy as she watched her dad blend into crowd. She thought about what he had said earlier about opening the door for the Iron Reapers, about giving them a chance to change, and it felt like that idea was no longer just a vague plan. It was becoming a reality, right in this moment, as Willow Creek not only stood strong against adversity, but was also ready to reach out to those who had once been enemies. She took a sip of the fresh coffee that Mary had just poured, the warmth making her feel more alert, and turned to her dad with a final question she couldn't keep to herself. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but firm, "if they really come back, not tomorrow, but in a few months or even years, and they want to change, do you think we can trust them? I mean, after everything they've done, how do we know they're not just pretending?" James paused, setting the pie down on the table, his gaze drifting across the surface of the lake as if the answer lay somewhere among the shimmering reflections on the water. "Trust isn't easy, Sophie," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "It's not something you give away lightly. But I've learned one thing in the military and in life. Trust isn't about believing in others right off the bat. It's about believing in their ability to change and then letting them prove it through their actions. If they come back, we won't just welcome them with open arms without caution. We'll test them, not with words, but with deeds." Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes lighting up as she grasped her father's meaning. She thought about how he had challenged the Iron Reapers today, not just with strength, but with kindness and patience. "So what will we do if they come?" she asked, her voice now tinged with a bit of excitement. "Dad talks about work like fishing or fixing boats, but what does that really mean?" James smiled, his gaze returning to the crowd chatting and laughing in the distance. "Let's start small," he said. "Some of them might know about motorcycles. They could work with the boats here. A few others might be strong. They can help unload cargo or fix the docks. I don't know what they're good at, Sophie, but I do know one thing. When you give someone a job to do, a place to belong, they'll start to find themselves again. I'll teach them, just like I taught my kids not just how to work, but how to live." Sophie felt her heart race as she listened to her father. She thought about how he had taught her to tie knots, read the wind, and care for the harbor since she was little, not just with words, but through actions, through patience. "Dad," she said, her voice now more certain than ever, if we do this, then Willow Creek won't just be a harbor anymore. It will be a place where people can start over." James turned to her, his eyes shining with pride that she could feel deeply. "That's right, Sophie," he said. "And that's the legacy I want to leave behind, not a victory on the dock. Not a story about defeating an enemy, but a place where even the most lost can find their way. I'm not doing this alone, my child, Tom. Everyone here, we're making this happen together." Sophie felt a sting in her eyes, not from sadness, but because she realized that her dad wasn't just talking about the Iron Reapers. He was speaking about a bigger vision, a legacy that stretched far beyond Willow Creek. She looked out at the crowd, where Old Man Ben was recounting the story of how he almost took down Razor with a stick, the laughter of everyone ringing out like a chorus. She glanced at Mary, who was pouring more coffee for a veteran, her eyes shining with joy, and she looked at her dad, standing there like a silent lighthouse, guiding not just her, but an entire community and maybe one day, even those who had once been enemies. Tom Grayson stepped forward, holding a tray of fresh pastries, his cheerful voice cutting through Sophie's thoughts. "Hey, you two," he said. "I think we should celebrate a bit more before everyone heads home. James, do you want to tell the story of how you took down Razor? Everyone's been asking to hear it." James laughed heartily, patting Tom on the shoulder. "I think they've heard enough already, Tom," he said. "But I'm going to share another story about how we stand together today, and about what we can achieve tomorrow." Sophie smiled and stepped up to stand beside her dad as he began to tell a story, his voice resonating in the night air, warm and full of life. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her heart, feeling as if each word he spoke was a brick laying the foundation of the legacy he was nurturing today. She thought about Razor, about Ethan, about the guys who had once threatened this place, and wondered if one day they would truly return not with clubs and knives, but with empty hands, ready to work, ready to change. As James's story came to an end, the crowd erupted in applause, laughter ringing out once more, and Sophie felt a profound peace wash over her heart. She gazed out at the lake, where the lights on the dock now shone brightly in the darkness, and she knew that Willow Creek was not just her home, it was a beacon, a place where her father's kindness had ignited a flame, not just for today, but for many years to come. She held her father's hand, feeling as though he was not just her hero, he was the one who would turn a stormy day into an everlasting legacy. James turned to her, his gaze gentle yet firm. "Are you ready, Sophie?" he asked, his voice soft but full of meaning. "This journey has only just begun." Sophie nodded, a smile on her face, her voice ringing confidently in the night air. "I'm ready, Dad," she said. "I want to be a part of this legacy with you, with everyone." The night continued to drift, the lights from Willow Creek still shining, like a promise that this story wouldn't end here. James Miller hadn't just protected a harbor. He had sown a seed of kindness, a legacy that would live on, not just in Sophie's heart, but in the hearts of everyone who had stood on the wooden dock today, and those who would come in the future. And as Sophie looked up at the starry sky, she knew that legacy would echo even further, to places she couldn't even begin to imagine. Thank you for joining us on this inspiring journey at Willow Creek, where James Miller not only protects his home, but also sows the seeds of kindness, turning enemies into hope. If you love this journey from darkness to light, please hit like and subscribe to our channel, so you won't miss any stories that touch the heart. We truly cherish every moment you spend here, feeling the power of unity and belief in the good. This isn't just a victory. It's a legacy that lives on, reminding us that everyone deserves a chance to change. We'll see you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon.